case of whether Tyr is the chief god of the Norse pantheon or not, and I insist that he's definitely not, is something I've discussed in a long-form video and in one of YouTube's newfangled shorts. Well, here is something kind of in the middle for people who are curious about this question, and for me to emphasize that this is about not so much being responsible about our sources, although we need to do that, but to be smart about putting our sources in the proper context. I start this video by thanking my Patreon supporters who help make it possible for me to make a living teaching subjects of my expertise in the world's most beautiful places, and to everyone who buys my books, thank you so much. Now, when I say the proper context, what I mean is, what are our sources for stories about the Norse gods? Principally, they are two books called Edda, written in Iceland in the 1200s, the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda. And the Poetic Edda is much more of a primary source than the Prose Edda, because Snorri Sturluson in the Prose Edda is taking poems like those in the Poetic Edda and trying to explain them for an audience who's no longer familiar with this stuff. And he himself, not being a believer in these deities, is inclined to try to over-systematize stuff about them. To that end, he actually probably exaggerates Tyr's importance in saying that he is, he makes him kind of a, not a war god precisely, but someone who doesn't make peace between men, he says, which could actually be a misunderstanding of something that Loki says about him in the poem Lokasenna, where he says that that Tyr cannot bera tilt med tveim, carry well with two, but this may just mean that he can't carry well with two hands because he's one-handed, and Snorri's misunderstanding that as being he can't make peace between two men. But really, at the core, the only significant story that we have about Tyr is related to his being one-handed. He's the only one brave enough to put his hand in Fenrir's mouth when the gods are trying to imprison him till Ragnarok, and so Fenrir bites his hand off, because it's a pledge that the bindings that they're putting on him won't bind him, and of course they will, so Fenrir bites his hand off, and everybody laughs except Tyr. So everybody's willing to laugh at Tyr's misfortune, even though it implies their fortune. There's also Hymiskvida in the Poetic Edda, where Tyr is treated as a son of an anti-god, a Jotun, quote-unquote giant, named Hymir. This is almost certainly not his origin. In fact, the entire character of Tyr in that poem does not really seem like it should be him. It seems like, if anything, it ought to be Loki, as a lot of those details in that story look a lot like the story of Thor and Loki visiting Utgard the Loki. So it looks like Tyr is kind of a leftover, kind of a not so important god. So why do so many of the, big beard pagan guru people on the internet and their 19th century spiritual predecessors insist that Tyr is a bigger deal than Óðinn? I'll talk about that in just a moment. Let me give you a quick word from my friends and partners at Grimfrost. Now, my background is in Indo-European historical linguistics, so sometimes it surprises people that I don't insist that Tyr is the main god, because after all, his name is cognate with Zeus. It's from the same Indo-European root. But it's the wrong context for our sources, right? Yeah, sure, his name is cognate with that. That doesn't mean that in the stories about these gods that he's anything special. It might mean that that name once was applied to a more important god. Was that god anything like the Tyr that we read about in the Poetic and the Prose Edda? A guy who puts his hand in the mouth of a wolf. It's a big deal, it's important, but it's really the only important thing about him. Somewhere in the course of thousands of years, that probable sky god, Deus Pater, something like that in Proto-Indo-European, somewhere he's lost the pater, the father part, because Tyr's never called father of anything. Óðin's often called the father, or orderer, depending on what some of those compounds mean. But Tyr never is. He's lost that father part, and he's become just Tyr. In fact, the name is so general that it can be just used as a word for God, right? In the plural Tibar, we see it pretty often as just a generic word for God in the Poetic Edda. So, let's consider that whatever important being that name or the ancestor of that name was applied to probably has almost nothing to do with any stage of this mythology that's anything like the stuff that's in the Eddas, right? You can kind of have one or the other. You can say like, well, here's this Proto-Indo-European pantheon, which you can't really actually reconstruct very well, that has an important sky deity probably named something like Deus Pater. And you can say thousands and thousands of years later in a very different place, with a lot of different cultural mixing and a lot of just historical accident that's happened along the way, you have a pantheon of gods that's worshipped that still includes a god with a name descended from that earlier sky god's name, but who no longer is very important at all. Now, it's possible that in maybe a millennium before the Viking Age, when the Romans were encountering Germanic-speaking peoples, that Tyr, or something like Proto-Germanic Tiwaz would have been his name at this stage, was a little more important. It's interesting that in the Interpretatio Germanica of the Roman names of the days of the week, we get Tuesday, Tyr's Day, as Mars's Day, right? Martes in Spanish, Marty in French. That might imply that at that time Tyr was a more important war god. But by the time of, again, the poems that go into the Poetic Edda, so probably the late Viking Age and the centuries just after that, what we see is instead a god who is mentioned basically in one myth where he's important. His hand gets bitten off. He gets kind of like assimilated into myths where it doesn't really look like he belongs, like the Hemisphere, the myth of Thor retrieving the cauldron and fishing for the Midgard of the serpent. And then otherwise has receded totally into the background, with Óðinn absolutely having taken over as both sort of the chief of the pantheon, the father figure to the pantheon, to such an extent that Snorri tries to make everybody his son in convoluted ways, and then, other parts of the Prose Edda shows that he's absolutely not everybody's literal father, but he's a father figure to the pantheon in a Zeus-like way. Óðinn's taken over that role and more of the war god role. So that's what's actually in Norse mythology. Whatever preceded Norse mythology might have been different, and there might have been a Tyr ancestral figure who was a much bigger deal, but not in anything like the Eddas. Well, I hope that has helped a little bit with putting some more context and, responsibility, I guess is a word, it almost sounds like a patronizing word. It's not how I mean it. Like, I try to be responsible with my sources, right? Put them in the right context. A little more context, a little more responsibility on our use of sources of Norse myth. Hope you've enjoyed this awesome view that I found, even though it's got a road here. I think the road actually kind of adds to it. And from beautiful San Juan's in southwestern Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.